Hi everyone, I am recording a screencast video lecture for Module 6. I'm going to be going over chapters 16 and 19, which are the chapters that you're supposed to read for this week. And then I'm also going to discuss the assignments that you have for this week, which includes the outline activity, which there are a lot of steps to it, so it can come off as a little confusing. And then you have a blog assignment, which is on logical fallacies. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in this lecture. So starting off with chapter 16, it's introduction to texts that argue, and we've had these kind of introduction to texts that blank kind of chapters before. So this one focuses on those texts that argue. So some of it should hopefully be sounding familiar at this point because you've been doing a lot of work up to thinking about argument, particularly as you've been doing the rhetorical analysis and you've been examining texts and talking about the effectiveness of those texts and how they present arguments. So the purpose of doing those types of assignments are to prepare you to write your own texts that present an argument. So instead of reading and dissecting a text for its effectiveness, you yourself are going to be working on being effective at delivering your own argument. So we're kind of transitioning a little bit from examining other writers' effectiveness to thinking about your writing and its effectiveness, particularly when it comes to argument, because you have that upcoming classical argument paper. The draft is actually due next week in Module 7. So, but all of these assignments are meant to build on each other and are related. Excuse me. So for this particular chapter, I'm just going to briefly talk about some of those takeaways from it. I try to highlight what I consider to be the kind of most important things, although there's arguments to that. There's arguments for everything. So I pulled a quotation from our author that I thought was really valuable from this particular chapter because it explains, why is it that we write arguments. So part of a problem that's normal for students and particularly with student writing is, why am I doing this? And I remember feeling that way through a lot of my years as a college student, and sometimes I still feel like that, but it's kind of like, why do I have to write this thing? And we write different things for lots of reasons, whether it's something for your work or whether you're arguing for the effectiveness of a project or an initiative, or whether you're, arguing for more money or anything like that, why you should get a promotion or why you should get a raise. We're always making arguments in different spaces, those different discourse communities, to harken back to earlier in the term. But, Dively, our author, says that, argument is an effective vehicle for exhibiting, developing, and assessing critical thinking skills. And that last part is, argument is a way for somebody to determine where you are cognitively in terms of your ability to engage and execute critical thinking. So that's why on standardized tests, regardless of the standardized test, if you're taking the LSATs for law school, if you're taking the MCATs for med school, if you're taking the different types of standardized exams, there's always going to be a section that assesses critical thinking skills, and that's usually done through reading and then writing an argumentative essay about the topic that they provide you. So writing, and in particular the argumentative genre of writing, that is what scholarly writing is. Scholarly writing is all argumentative. It is a way of assessing and demonstrating critical thinking. And also it's an effective vehicle for expanding perspectives, advancing knowledge, and encouraging productive change. So that's what we can hope that argument does. So Okay, so she goes on to talk about some of the things that you want to do when you argue, or not do, but well, you want to do them, but you want to pay close attention to those things. And she talks about tone, about when you write academically. Um, so when writing, she doesn't use the word academic, but it's really what she's alluding to. I might be extrapolating, but I'm not, because it's the name of the text is Invention and Craft: A Guide to College Writing. So the type of writing that's done in college is academic writing. So I am extrapolating, but um, she doesn't explicitly use the term academic writing. She calls it, a position paper or a profile, but she never really calls it academic writing. I'm not sure why, but that's the type of writing she's talking about. So when writing an argument paper, and I would add, and in academic writing, which is one of the main discourse communities in which in which argumentative writing happens, is you want to be aware of the tone in which you use. And she gives the examples of steering away from verbal attacks. So you don't want your writing to, you want your argument to be aggressive, and this is why I love writing, because I can be really rude and really aggressive, but the way I choose to write it, the author might not pick that up. And so that's why I think writing is very deceptive, and the way that we can use writing to get things for ourselves, and the way we can make argument effectively, we can deceive people. It is a very deceptive act, and I do it all the time. You kind of have to sometimes, because you don't want to be outright verbally attacking. There are places to do that. They're not considered credible, but there are places, you can go and verbally attack. But if you want to be more effective at arguing, you have to know how to do verbal attacking in a way that is not rhetorically very obvious. So there are ways of manipulating language and manipulating the way we write to make it seem like we're being nice and friendly while we're arguing and being fair and objective, but there is a motive behind that. So that's fun. I love that part of writing where it's like, you think I'm being nice, but actually I think you're stupid for not paying attention to my argument. So that's sometimes a driving motivation in writing. It's all about the rhetoric and the way you choose to word what you're saying. If I was just to go ahead and say what I actually thought, my writing would not be taken seriously. So you have to manipulate your rhetoric and manipulate the way you speak so that the people will take your argument seriously, and they'll want to join in on your conversation or extend it, or engage with it in some way. So maintaining that, always being aware of how your reader could possibly interpret what you're saying, but then also being able yourself to manipulate your rhetoric so that you ensure that your reader has a particular interpretation is also a way of using rhetoric. So it's interimplicative, it's multi-directional, it goes both ways. So maybe I shouldn't be saying those things. That makes me sound like a bad person, but that's what arguers do. I was originally pre-law way back in the day. I still have dreams of going to law school, but I think I've said before, English is the most common pre-law major. So, and lawyers argue for a living, and that's what literary people do. People in literature, we argue for a living. So, it is a skill, and it takes years of practice to kind of figure it out. And I still haven't figured it out. It's just always experimenting. So steering away from those verbal attacks. She doesn't, I can't remember. She does, I don't know if she uses the word hedging or not, but she talks about hedging. And I've mentioned hedging a little bit, but hedging is where you, is not speaking in absolute truths or universal statements. So I'm going to give an example of one. Well, she also says, and I liked that she said this because I'd never thought of it in that way, but she talked about on page 279, she says, staying in her quote is the realm of the probable. So when you are making an argument, you're not, unless you're in physics, and I don't even know much. I didn't do well in physics as an undergrad because I'm not that, my brain doesn't work that way. So unless you're talking about some type of physical law, which even I think that's arguable, like that we call it a physical law, that would be a semantic argument. But normally, in probably 99% of situations, you're not arguing for an absolute truth. You're not arguing for a universal statement. There is no answer to these things. It's kind of just like, what is the best argument? And I had a professor once who used the metaphor of argument is this way of chipping away at an iceberg where this supposed yet imaginary truth is at the center. It's inside that iceberg. And as we argue, we think we're chipping away at this iceberg to get at what we think is the truth. But if we were to ever to get there, there'd be nothing there because we make our own truths and we do our own meaning making through the act of arguing. So that's what the entire legal system is based on. So if we think about, for example, what the definition of pornography is or what the definition of obscenity is, those are things that the federal government has had to sit down and say, okay, when we give an MA rating to something, what does that mean and why? There's no truth in it except the truth that we impose on it. So so they make arguments about it, but it's not a universal truth. It's not like gravity, for example, where we call it gravity and we know it by gravity through the term, but we know that there's this thing that exists that if I were to take my computer that I'm looking at right now and move it off my desk, it would fall on the floor. Like, I know that would be a thing that would happen because that exists. So that's more like a universal thing versus all of these very subjective things that don't have absolute truths. So when you hedge, and there are times to hedge, and then there's times to not hedge. So it's just about knowing when you need to hedge and when you need not to hedge. And when we say hedge, we mean using words like arguable or probable or likely or perhaps. It's getting out of the realm of absolute truths. So, for example, if I could go back to my talking about obscenity and like the legal definitions of that, if I were to say something like oh geez, this is a hard one. Why did I choose such a hard description? Okay, I'll my mind is going to video games because that's usually where it goes. But video games that contain shooting leads to more deaths by shooting. Okay, that's an example of that statement would be me positing something like it's a universal truth. This is also a logical fallacy. So it also has to do, because what I could do as a reader, if I were reading this, I could say, wait a minute, I have all of these facts and, well, not facts, I don't believe in facts, but all of these, reports and arguments that say the opposite. This needs what's called qualification, which the Toolman taxonomy gets into in terms of qualifying. But it's just saying this equals this. So that's fallacious. That's fallacious logic. It's flawed logic. It's a fallacy. So all you have to do to get around fallacious logic is to hedge rhetorically. That's all you got to do. So if I was dead set on arguing this, I could say that video games that contain shooting arguably, oh God, I have wrong subject verb agreement. I'm terrible. And I can't spell. Arguably lead to more deaths by shooting. Just by entering that one word, I've steered clear of anyone freaking out, of any of my readers who might oppose this argument or have something to say about it. Just by hedging, just by using the rhetorical choice of hedging and saying, and going back into the realm of the probable, which I didn't put my end quotation there, I have now stepped out of making an absolute truth or a universal statement, and I've now said, arguably this could lead to more deaths by shooting. And now here's some evidence that helps corroborate what I'm saying is not true, but probable. And then we should examine game ratings or whatever the argument is that might be made in that type of writing. So she talks about tone. The thing she doesn't mention is formal tone. I'm going to bring it up because you want to make sure that we call it American Academic English, otherwise known as AAE. Very exciting. And a lot of you have been doing really well with American Academic English so far. It's hard to tell with this class because of the nature of the assignments that you've had up to this point have been very different than, for example, what my literature students are writing. So when I've talked a little bit about what they're doing, they, from the very beginning, have had to do argumentative writing where they're integrating evidence, making arguments, and they're struggling because it's not easy, but they've been doing that from day one. Whereas in this class, you've done a lot of more what I would call in the realm of creative writing. And that may or may not be helpful for you by the time you get to writing the classical argument paper and I think it is like problem solution paper. I can't remember if it's the position paper or the problem solution paper. But there's two full-blown academic research papers coming your way real soon. And I'm a little nervous that the writing for those is going to be drastically different, or the writing expectations and writing requirements for those, like those actual research papers, are going to radically differ from the type of writing that you've done. So I'm a little trepidatious for you. So, but because you guys have been doing what I would say in general really well, like you guys are crafting your writing really well, but I'm hoping that translates or transfers to this other type of writing, which is American Academic English. And that's where we want to write writing in a formal academic tone. This doesn't mean using big fancy words. It means, I forgot my arrow. It means being concise, precise, demonstrating knowledge, that all-important critical thinking, executing analysis in a really kind of adept way, and integrating sources with acumen. So being able to, because your classical argument paper, I believe, requires 4 sources. So you'll probably pool 4 of the 7 sources that you use for your annotated bibliography to use for your classical argument paper, and then integrate those. But again, that's very different writing than the type of writing you've been doing. So I'm a little nervous because what it's asking from you in terms of what the term and the class is asking from you is to go from one type of writing to a very different type of writing. So we're going to see how that works. Okay, so and then she goes on to talk about structure. So she first talks about tone, and then she talks about structure. And the structure is, I've used the word methodology before. That's what it is. It's organization. It's, the way you go about presenting information in your paper. And then she uses the Toulmin's taxonomy, and this is on page 280 in your textbooks. And Toulmin, I don't think it's that, but that would be more fun. I don't know how to say it. Toulmin, I think it's French, but whatever. Okay, so we'll just call him Toulmin. The Toulmin's taxonomy on page 280, he takes us through, because I'm assuming it's a man, claim, data, warrant, the backing, qualifier, and then point of rebuttal. So this is and there's our author provides you a matrix of the taxonomy and then an example of what all of these, like one matrix that provides definitions for what all of these mean, and then a matrix that gives an example of what they would look like within the realm of argumentation. And as our author states, it's like these things should look familiar. She's just some of the things she's saying in a way that's a little bit different. Like claim obviously is your thesis or argument. Data, right, is your evidence. Oh, sorry, my spelling today is awful. The warrant, which is a thing that students tend to forget about, is why the claim is warranted, which is why she calls it, or why I'm presuming she calls it warrant, because I've never heard it called warrant before. But I do talk about this, right? So she talks about it again in the quotations I pulled from chapter 19. She talks about this in more detail about why the claim is, like why your argument is necessary or why it's warranted. That's an important thing. And then there's the backing, right, which is more support, the qualifying. The point of rebuttal is sometimes what's called the opposition. So this is the opposite of what you're arguing that you need to address. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a phone call. I always turn off my FaceTime, but for some reason it just always goes off, and I have never bothered to figure out why. So I apologize. That's just me being lazy. Sorry, I was just pulling up page 280 in the textbook, but the where I got confused in Toulmin's taxonomy was the difference between data and evidence and backing. So the data and evidence is stated as reasons you provide in support of your claim, and then the backing is evidence that supports your warrant. So this is evidence that supports why it's warranted. So the way that I can think to differentiate data versus backing is that how do I want to say this? Evidence that justifies that your claim is warranted. And this is other say other evidence. It doesn't make much sense because I just said evidence here. But the data parts are your claims, right? So you have so I'm not going to use the word evidence there. And she calls them subclaims. I can't remember if it was chapter 16 or 19, but she does call them subclaims. Those are those things, the arguments that you're making in your body paragraphs. So you have your major claim, thesis / argument, and then in support of that, you have, okay, I'm arguing this, and to support that, I have this subclaim, this subclaim, this subclaim, this subclaim. Sometimes I know them better as premises, like you have a premise to support your thesis, but subclaim works just as well. So these are kind of your claims, and then you have why the claim is warranted, and then the backing is, here's evidence that shows that this is in fact a debatable topic worthy of argumentation. And then the qualifier is really the way you go about writing your argument. It's kind of it says here, words, phrases, or sentences that establish the extent to which or conditions under which your argument is reasonable. So it's kind of like your argument isn't just a free-for-all. There are things, there's going to be a boundary, or what we would say your claim is continent, which means that it's bound within some type of discourse. It's not incontinent, right? It just can't peek out and go into all these different areas of discursivity. Your claim has to be bound in some way, and then you have the opposition, or the counter argument is the other thing that it's sometimes referred to as. So that's Toulmin's taxonomy. Toulmin's taxonomy is also important because in the outline activity, these different documents that you're asked to look at are all kind of based on Toulmin's taxonomy. So, and I opened all of those, so I may open those to look at those. But so Toulmin's taxonomy does come back, just not explicitly. Just kind of your outline activity is vaguely and indirectly based on Toulmin's taxonomy. Okay, so that is, the only other thing which I'm not going to really talk about, but that our author talks about in chapter 16 are the logical fallacies. And I'm not going to talk about them at length because they're kind of self-explanatory once you read them. They're on, sorry, I was just looking for the page number. It's page 294. Nope, 284, sorry. I just can't write well on my notebook. So on page 284, if you go there, you'll see that she has another matrix / figure there, and this is part of what you're doing for that logical fallacy assignment, which I'll talk about now. And I copied the instructions from Canvas. So this is a blog assignment, and it says, write chapter 16, details 10 common logical fallacies, and then all of them are named, and then goes through what you want to do. So it says, start it by explaining in your own words what logical fallacies are, why you want to avoid them, and persuasive. And when you see the word persuasive, just think argumentative, because when we argue, we are trying to persuade. So, right, for example, how might logical fallacies affect a writer's appeal to ethos and logos? And how is a fallacious argument different from a bad argument? I don't think there's a difference, but maybe you guys can think of one. I will be curious to see what you come up with, because in my head, whenever I've read that, I've been like, a fallacious argument is a bad argument. So, or it's really just an argument missing. It's missing something that's not bad. It's missing actual argument, or actual logic. But so good luck with that question. So once you do that, once you kind of talk about in your own words, like what logical fallacies are and why they should be avoided and how they can affect a writer's ethos and logos, you want to identify at least 3 fallacies in one or more persuasive piece. So like you've been looking for sources in the past, you're going to be looking for sources again, and it gives you suggestions on where you might locate them. So a good place to locate logical fallacies: advertisements, political speeches, letters to the editor, cartoons, and articles in magazines or newspapers. And you want to name the fallacy type and explain why the example is a fallacy, right? What is the logical flaw, right? What is the flaw in the reasoning? So first, you're going to talk about what logical fallacies are and why they're bad, why we want to avoid them in argumentative writing. Then locating 3 fallacies in 3 different sources that you locate. And then do some reflection on that process that you just did, and then go back and respond to 2 of your classmates in terms of what they did for this particular blog. I had a question when I was reading this, which I don't know if any of you would have a similar question, which is, do they have to be 3 distinct fallacies? And because what I'm reading here, this has a lot of room for interpretation. It's in one or more persuasive piece, right? So you can locate one thing and then identify 3 different fallacies in there. And I think what you want to do is identifying 3 different fallacies, right? Like the red herring versus the bandwagon versus slippery slope versus blah, 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 blah. So if you just find one thing, one piece, and you're able to successfully identify 3 different logical fallacies in that, that's great. If you have to find 2 pieces or 3 pieces where you have the 3 different fallacies, then that's okay too. You just need to make sure that it's actually a persuasive piece, and I'm saying that because when I was grading the visual analyses, occasionally someone would chose an image that didn't have an explicit author, and an author is anybody who's working to get that piece out, right? So it could have been a company, an organization, anything like that. So you want to make sure that the persuasive piece you choose is, because without an author, you don't have a target audience. And so then that begs the question, and begging a question can be a logical fallacy, but that begs the question of, well, then to whom is this piece attempting to persuade, and what are they persuading, and what are they trying to persuade them about? So you just want to make sure that whatever piece or pieces you identify actually have an author and a targeted audience. And then make sure that, I'm just going to make the executive call, there are 3 different fallacies. So the number of pieces can differ between 1 and 3, but you do want to talk about 3 different fallacies. So that's the logical fallacies assignment, and that's talked about in chapter 16. So I'm going to move on to chapter 19, which talks about the position paper. And I'm not going to talk about, the chapter does, I underlined a lot in this chapter, and as you can see, I pulled 2 quotations because I thought they were helpful, because it really talks about argument. So, and even our author in the beginning of this chapter talks about, like, well, she essentially talks about, like, well, why don't we just call these research papers or argument papers? And she's kind of making an argument that position papers is this large umbrella where all of these other kind of argumentative genres fall under. I personally don't agree with her, but that's me. A position paper, and then she goes on to say, and this is the definition that she provides of a position paper, is the goal of a position paper is to carve out your own position in the midst of an issue's complexity, and then you can improve your ability to argue a firm stance on this and other issues that provoke an intense reaction from you by recognizing the conventions of position papers. And I got that quote wrong with that S. So that's her definition of a position paper. You're reading this chapter because next week you have that classical argument draft that's due. So the classical, I know my computer's like, I need to fix my computer, but the classical argument paper is a position paper. It's just a paper where you take a position, which means you have an argument. So and that's kind of what she talks about a little bit in the beginning of her chapter. So it can get a little confusing in terms of, well, what's the genre of the position paper versus just a plain old argument paper versus this other type of paper? Because there's different types of argument papers. I'm not going to get into them, but the one you're writing, the classical argument paper, just be thankful that you have that, because there are some argument papers that the genre is just really weird and not common. So the classical argument paper is a classical research and argument paper. So it's very standard in terms of what that assignment is going to be asking from you. The other quotation that I really liked is something that I feel like I'm always trying to express to students, because they always have a hard time with it because it's not an easy thing to do. But she talks about, and this has to do with where I thought it was in here, but with the structure, where she talks about structure. This is kind of an extension of her conversation of structure, but in chapter 19. But she talks about position papers first provide an overview of the controversy, which makes that the issue is indeed debatable. Did I quote that right? Now I'm what page? I'm glad I put the page number. Nope. This is why you always have to check your quotation. So, which makes clear that the issue is indeed debatable. In most cases, the author demonstrates debatability by briefly representing differing positions. Think of all of this as happening in the introduction. Doing so educates readers about various stances that have already been articulated. It also strengthens the author's ethos or credibility by demonstrating that he or she fully understands the nuances of the debate. So, and this goes into, this is an extension of, if I can find it, which I probably won't. Not quickly. It's like I don't have that much up here. But that idea of carving a space for your own argument, you have to do that. And that takes work in writing. You can't just say, if I was going with this bad argument that I was making up here about video games, it's not that it's a bad argument. It's not very well written what I wrote. But if I were writing a paper about, and I've taught a lot of video games stuff, like video game texts in the past, because I find them very interesting. So I've read a lot of student papers on video games, and so I've read a lot about it. But if I were writing a paper about this, or this was my argument, and I have an example paper. So we'll start down here. So if somebody gave me this as their thesis, I would say, okay, you have a good start to a thesis, but it's not a complete thesis. So video games that contain shooting arguably lead to more deaths by shooting. So that, well, it depends. So if this is my thesis, I would expect, because so what I, as the instructor, look for example, if I were reading that as somebody's thesis, I would look for specific work in the introduction that leads up, or I'd say leads into that narrow of a thesis. So in order to do the work that needs to be done rhetorically in the introduction to prep the reader for this thesis statement, a lot of stuff has to get done. So first, I wanted to use numbers instead. So first, the writer would have to identify that there is a debatable issue or controversy that exists between video games with shooting and death by shooting. I don't know. It's not a good argument, but so just bear with me. So first, the writer has to identify that there's an actual issue, and it can't just be the writer saying, this is an issue, because the reader is going to be like, you're full of hot air. I need proof. So that being said, right, then you have to do this part, briefly representing differing positions. This is including evidence in the introduction to further strengthen, never spelled that word right, the notion that the controversy the writer has chosen is in fact a, I'll just say is in fact debatable or a controversy. So, it usually comes in the form of having both sides is more helpful. So the more evidence, I hate to write this because I feel like it could be taken the wrong way, but the more evidence offered in the introduction strengthens, again, I can never spell this word, strengthens the writer's ethos, credibility, right? Like they know what they're talking about. So it's not that you just want an introduction that's full of quotations, because that's not what you want. That's just to say that if you have an introduction where you're like, this side, right, you know, such and such games, or, you know, Sony or Rockstar or whomever, whatever game developers or game companies, would probably look at this and have problems and say, no, this is not true. Whereas other groups might say, this is true, we have proof. So what I mean by when I say this is usually by incorporating both the side that helps support your argument as well as the rebuttal side, or the counter argument / opposition, helps to increase your